I recently completed my first Vipassana meditation retreat, and don't worry, it was completely virtual, so 100% social distance style. I had the opportunity to rent out an Airbnb in a beautiful forested area, and I honestly couldn't have asked for a better retreat setting. The meditation retreat itself was absolutely life-transforming. I had what I would consider to be an enlightenment experience. However, I want to be completely clear and honest here. I am not enlightened. What this retreat showed me more than anything is just how deeply this path really goes. It instilled a sense of humility and awe at just how much we can transform ourselves, how deeply we can embody our true nature through our individuality. It's not about reaching one level of consciousness and stopping. This path is a lifelong journey of embodiment and refinement as we move closer and closer to source, to truth. Even though I can't claim to be enlightened, I would be lying if I said this didn't have what seems to be a permanent shift. As I've reintegrated back into real life, the overall awakening has permeated into my experience such that my sense of self no longer feels solid or necessarily real in the traditional sense. My sense of self feels more like a comfortable pair of shoes I can put on or take off depending on what the circumstance calls for. Subject-object duality remains spacious, flow-like, and can collapse and rebuild moment by moment depending on what my given state is. In this video, I briefly go over what enlightenment is, as well as how the overall experience unfolded and what happened. I would recommend staying until the end of the video, however, as only getting half of this message would be to not fully understand what is being communicated. The implications of what I'm talking about could be quite psychologically disturbing or confusing if you don't stick around until the end and hear what the ramifications are. But with that introduction out of the way, I hope you enjoy the video. Hey there, so I just got back from a 9-day Vipassana meditation retreat where we were meditating on average for around 9 hours, give or take. Some days a little less, some days a little more, just depending on the schedule. As you can imagine, meditating for hours on end tends to put us in a state of consciousness that is very different than our normal waking, sober state. When we're going off and working and living life, communicating with other people, that is a particular mode of being. But on the other hand, when you are literally meditating non-stop for hours and hours and hours, not talking and just reflecting on yourself, on your whole life, every minute of every day, that tends to put us in a different space. So in the context of enlightenment, what this means is that we start to get a lot more clear on what is true, what is authentic about our experience, about ourself, about our life, and what is not. What is a belief? What is a falsehood? What is an illusion? And so directly answering that question, well, what is enlightenment? We can think of enlightenment as becoming aware of what is true. It's like getting what is true the most we could possibly get. So enlightenment is just understanding, becoming aware of what is true. Another way to think about enlightenment might be to be exactly where you are right now, like just extremely present as you could possibly imagine. Absolutely just 100% locked in and present within the moment. Another definition of enlightenment might be coming into contact in union, coming into union with the present moment. So entering a state of consciousness where you are literally just so present that the past and the future no longer exist. If we think about what the past and the future is from a metaphysical point of view, the past and the future are both just mental constructs being overlaid on top of the present moment. The past only quite literally exists as a construct of the mind, and future, it's the exact same nature except it's projected forward. So our minds create this linear movement across time, which is moving from past to future, but it is overlaid on top of the present moment. We can think of enlightenment as the union of us, ourself, with the present moment. Another definition of enlightenment could be becoming aware or becoming conscious of the fact that the self is an illusion, that who we are as individuals and egos is not actually our real self, is not actually who we are at the most existential of levels. At the deepest levels of reality, we are not an ego, we are not an individual, we are something else. So enlightenment could be thought of as becoming aware of what we are at that bedrock level of reality, and being very clear on the fact that this ego, this persona that we present the world with, the persona that we interact with everyone using, is not actually who we are. It's no more us than the clothes that we're wearing. All of these different definitions of enlightenment are just that, though. They're just definitions, they're just pointers, and they're not actually the thing itself. If we return back to what I said at the beginning, enlightenment is becoming conscious of what is true, what is most authentically true about this moment. Well, no thought can ultimately existentially be true because of the nature of thoughts, which is that thoughts must exist as a function of time. All thoughts exist in sentence format. Sentences require a beginning and an end. I guess I'm reading right to left so a beginning and an end, and therefore exist as a function of time. But we just defined the fact that the present moment is the only moment that actually exists, and time, past and future, exist as mental constructs being overlaid on top of the moment. So all of this crazy nonsense is basically to say that enlightenment is a really strange thing. And all those definitions that I just gave, those are good pointers. Those are pointers that I can use to define what the experience was like for me, or what I'm defining as enlightenment. But ultimately, that's not enlightenment. Enlightenment cannot be thought of, it cannot be felt, it cannot be observed like a scientific observation or experiment. It's something that you have to become aware of for yourself. It's something that you have to just get. And it starts with realizing that who we are is not merely an individual. And I think that's a really good definition of where to start. So on the meditation retreat, how did it happen? Well, again, you're meditating for hours and hours and hours and hours on end. And what ends up happening is that because of this, your mind starts operating in a different way. For me, what happened was I became a lot more sensitized to all of my perception, just incredibly sensitized. So I guess if you think about how if you take a drug, like if you smoked weed or if you drank alcohol, how that starts changing the way that you perceive things. With alcohol, you might feel like these warm, fuzzy feelings inside of your body. Suddenly you're like super aware of them, but then part of your body gets a little dull and less clear. And weed, kind of the same thing. Maybe you start hearing music and it's more beautiful and the lights are more sensitized, but there's a dullness associated with it. Well, I would say meditation, on the other hand, if you're doing it for really long hours at a time, it's like all of that. You get these altered, heightened states of perception, except without the dullness. It's just full on, pure, clear, clean perception. It's quite a wonderful experience, but, and I don't necessarily mean to relate it to drugs. I just know that that's a pretty good, I'm sure it's a pretty good way to relate it to people, I think. Maybe you guys disagree. Anyways, so you get into this altered state of perception and you're starting to see things very, very, very clearly. Well, one of the byproducts of that is that you start to see how your sense of self is just a perception. And just like our vision, for example, like seeing things, you'll notice how your sense of vision is constantly changing depending on where you go. It's like in this constant flux of impermanence. No 1 second of your vision is the same as a prior second. In some way, shape, or form, something about your sight has changed, whether it's a tiny, tiny alteration of light because a planet is spinning, or whether it's you blinking, or whether it's a dust particle moving that you've barely noticed. No matter what, there's some aspect of your vision that has changed across time. Well, interestingly enough, that is exactly what is going on with our sense of self, our ego, our individuality. Every single second, some facet of who we are as an ego has changed. Our ego is in this constant state of impermanence. If we think about this from a macroscopic point of view, this is why when we're a child, our personalities are one way, and when we die, our personalities are in another way. And we can even divide this up into smaller segments. So like ages 1 through 10, you kind of have one set of personality traits, personas. 10 through 20, you've got another whole epoch of personality alterations and changes, and the same thing across your entire life. So we see this very clearly on a macroscopic lens, how our egos are changing, but it's only on a much finer scale and resolution do we struggle to see that even in every single moment, our self is in a constant state of change and fluctuation. So from a philosophical point of view, what this means is that cannot be us, the self, insofar as we're looking for a sense of self that is permanent, enduring. So the question is there a you, a facet of you, a feature of you that has stayed the same from the moment you were born to the moment that you die? Is there one enduring quality of the self? And the answer is yes. That is awareness, that is consciousness, the space in which all of this perception, all of this experiential field is existing within, it's existing within consciousness, it's existing within awareness. But every single bit of our perception, our sight, sound, the feeling of our body, our emotions, mental talk, mental images, all of this sense is constantly changing. But the one facet of us, of our experience that is not changing, is our awareness. And so this enlightenment experience on the meditation retreat, what happened is I literally just became so hyper aware of this fluctuating, energetic, fluid nature of my perception. And I just saw so clearly how none of it could be me, because me, the I amness, the I am, the clear recognition of my own existence, is a permanent, enduring feature of my life. And so therefore that none of that could be me, because I am, there's an enduring quality to what it means to be alive. And the same thing can be said for you. I'm not trying to turn this all about me, but all of us have this enduring quality of I amness, of selfhood. But it's not as an ego, it's not as an individual, it's as this like empty, open, spacious awareness. And what ends up happening when you enter into this state of realization, of awakening, so to speak, is that subject-object duality starts to collapse. So for example, like I'm looking at this camera is just as much me as this body, this mind, this ego, this individuality. So your sense of self starts to expand outward, and you start to identify with every bit of your experience. Every sight, every sound, every feeling, every body sensation, every person. When you see another person, you don't see them as like a separate individual, you see them as like an extension of yourself. Your sense of self expands out into them, because you realize that you cannot be this isolated body, mind, ego. You are the awareness, the consciousness that is aware and observing it, all of it. So what happens when your sense of self just expands out into every bit of your experience? Well, that's basically the equivalent of there not being a sense of self at all. The only way for your sense of self to really expand outward like that is for the sense of self to just disappear completely. And so from a very paradoxical point of view, by your sense of self, by our sense of self expanding out infinitely, that's also the equivalent of our sense of self just disappearing entirely. It's almost like infinity and zero are equivalent, are equal in a mathematical formula when it comes to the scale of the universe. Quite trippy and weird to think about. But going back to this this observation that we are not an individual, we are not a self, well, I just want to reiterate, man, like that's not the complete picture, because you have to remember that the individuality, while it's not you, it's still a part of you. There are some spiritual teachers that really kind of, for lack of a better term, shit on the ego. They shit on personality, individuality. And that's not what I'm trying to communicate here. Like, all of us have this very beautiful light and personhood that we can express to the world. And a lot of times, like, the expression of our individuality is one of the hardest parts of living life at all. Never mind all this enlightenment mumbo jumbo, but just authentically embodying who we are as a self on an egoic level is one of the most challenging, heart-wrenching sometimes things for us to do. So again, moving back to that definition of enlightenment is about authenticity, it's about truth. And a lot of times we are not truthfully and authentically expressing our individuality into the world. And so I think one extra bit I would like to say that I learned on this meditation retreat and this enlightenment experience was that even who we are as an individual is a facet of enlightenment, insofar as becoming very clear about our authentic desires, our authentic self-expression. That is just as much a part of the journey as becoming formless awareness and consciousness. So that was my experience, really seeing the nature of experience and everything. And so really the question is, well, like, what do you do moving forward? And I think for me, it's just keep on my path, just keep practicing. I want to make another video about this topic in particular. Actually, I think it warrants its own video, but the short answer is nothing changes at all. If you have some sort of enlightenment experience, nothing changes at all. You just keep going, just keep living life, just keep being you. And yeah, so that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope this sparks insight or something, and I will see you guys in the next video. Until next time.